I am Maya Ellis. I am 33. I live in Austin, Texas. And my job is operations manager for a mobile physical therapy company that sends therapists to clients' homes, which means my days are calendars, routes, and quiet phone calls where I fix what got double booked, soothe people who are in pain, and keep vans moving from point A to B with as little friction as possible. And maybe that is the first detail that matters because I live by schedules and maps. And the whole thing started on a Saturday at 3:18 p.m. when my boyfriend Tyler stood in the kitchen of our two-bedroom rental on Holly Street and asked if he could take my car for a quick trip to pick up charcoal for his cousin's barbecue. He said 15 minutes max. And he kissed my forehead and flashed the smile he uses when he wants me to say yes without thinking. And I said fine. Keys are on the hook. And I went back to arranging Monday's therapist routes. But I noticed that he left with my phone charger too, and that is unusual because his car has one and he hates mine. He always says my sedan feels like a dentist's waiting room on wheels, which is rude, but also not wrong, because I like things clean and I like the trunk empty, and the glove box has the registration, the insurance card, a pen, and a tiny flashlight that works. And I also like to know where my car is at all times, because after a catalytic converter theft last year, I had the shop install a hardwired GPS tracker under the dash, linked to an app on my phone. Plus, I tossed an AirTag into the spare tire well for good measure, which I never told Tyler because I do not narrate every safety habit I build after something goes wrong, and it was supposed to be a quiet Saturday. Laundry tumbling, the scent of lemon cleaner, the neighbor's chickens clucking through the fence, and the hum of a box fan. But at 3:49 p.m., 31 minutes after his 15-minute errand started, I felt that little itch behind my ears that means a schedule is about to break. I called. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. I texted. He sent back a thumbs up emoji. Then nothing, and I looked at the app because I am the kind of woman who looks at the app before I decide how upset to be, and the map said my car was not at HEB or Academy, or the hardware store on 7th. It was parked on the curb outside a place called Rook and Ember on West 4th Street, which is a rooftop bar with craft cocktails and shareable plates, and a host stand, where you cannot get a table at that hour without a plan. And I stood there with the phone in my hand while the dryer clicked, and Tyler's dog, a big sleepy mix named Bandit, thumped his tail against the cabinet, and the world narrowed, and I counted 3 choices. I could wait and pretend I don't see what I see. I could call him and start a fight that would teach him how to hide better. Or I could put on shoes and go find the truth while it is still warm. And because I am a woman who collects facts before I decide how I feel, I chose the shoes, jeans, gray t-shirt, ball cap, no makeup, and I slid my little crossbody bag over my shoulder, and I put Bandit in his crate with a chew, and I locked the door, and I left. And the sun hit like an oven when I stepped outside, because it was late September in Texas. And the heat loves concrete. The sidewalk shimmered, and I walked because it was only 9 blocks to East 5th, where the Metro Rail runs, and then I caught a scooter because Truth does not pay for parking, and the city smelled like dust, cilantro, and brake pads. And it took 12 minutes and 40 seconds to reach West 4th, and I parked the scooter beside a mural, and I stood across the street, and I saw my car first. My silver sedan with the bumper sticker that says, "Be kind, it costs nothing." And there it was, neat and smug. And I took a picture because sometimes your body needs proof before your mind can break. And then I went inside the building, past a lobby that smelled like grapefruit cleaner, up the elevator that reflected my face in brushed metal. And I told the host I was meeting a friend, and I walked slow, eyes scanning, and there he was, Tyler in a navy polo. I folded this morning, sitting at a two-top near the glass, laughing with a woman with a glossy brown bob and a gold watch. And she touched his wrist like they had a language, and he let her. And the table had 2 empty coupe glasses with sugar on the rims, and a plate with 2 forks that had been used, and a little folded check in a leather holder. And my stomach went cold and flat, like lake water at night. And then I felt something else. Not rage, not grief, not even shock. Just the quiet, steady feeling of buckling a seatbelt before a long drive. And I pulled my phone and took 4 photos from different angles, because I have learned that people argue against what they did when you leave them room. And then I walked away, because the worst choices are made in the first 10 seconds after you see what you did not want to see. And there was a small breeze, and the metal railing was warm under my hand, and the skyline looked like Legos for adults. And I sat on a bench by the planter, and I opened my notes app, and I wrote the time and the place. And what I saw, I wrote that he said 15 minutes, charcoal, cousin's barbecue, and instead he was here at 4:07 p.m., laughing and leaning with a woman who was not me. And I felt my hands steady and my breath slow. And when the server came with the check, they both tipped on the table, because you do that when you want to leave fast. And he stood, and she stood, and she linked her arm in his, like a clip. And they walked. And I stayed put, because the worst mistake would be a scene. I let them pass. I watched them through the glass. They took the elevator down, and I waited a count of 70. Then I stood, and I followed. Quiet, soft steps, no drama, just data collection. And I reached the ground floor and saw them pause by the door, and she said something. He grinned, and he dangled my keys in the air like a prize, and the sound of my key ring hitting his palm cracked a little part of me I did not know was still soft. And they walked to my car, and he opened her door first, and there is a part of me that can notice the way a man moves when he is proud to be seen, and another part that can recall whether my insurance covers a non-listed driver, and both parts were awake. And I stayed by the planter and lifted my phone and got the shot. His hand on the passenger door for her. Her knee bent into my car. The orange of the parking meter number in frame. And then they drove away. And I let them go because I did not want adrenaline driving. I wanted information. And I opened the tracking app again, and the little dot moved west, then south, then paused on Barton Springs Road by a boutique hotel with string lights over a courtyard. And the name of the hotel made my tongue taste metal, because it is where we stayed on our first anniversary. And I thought about how anniversaries only mean something when both people are there. And I ordered a rideshare, and the car smelled like coconut, and the driver's name tag said A&A in big letters. And she asked if I was okay because my face must have been a picture. And I said I was going to pick up my car. And she nodded like she has been a woman in a city before. And we pulled up across from the hotel, and I told her I might be a few minutes. Please keep the meter running if she could. And she said she could wait 10. And I got out and stood half behind a column, and I saw my car in valet. The little paper tag snapped to my mirror, and I watched Tyler pass the valet ticket to a kid with perfect hair, and the kid said something, and Tyler handed him a folded bill, and then Tyler and the woman went inside. And I could have walked across the street right then and said, "Give me my keys." But I did not, because something in me had already stepped out of the relationship and into a different role. I was the owner of a car and the keeper of a promise I made to myself that I would never again lower my standards to stay loved. And the owner of a car has options. And the first was the clean, simple one that made my shoulders drop an inch. I walked to valet. I smiled like a woman who lost a claim ticket. And I said, "That silver sedan is mine. I have the title in my glove box because I am like that. And I can show you the registration and my license. Can we please just settle this and let me take my car?" And the valet looked at me, then at the car, then at the folder I pulled from my bag where I keep laminated copies of my registration, because I have learned how institutions like neat paper, And he nodded and said if I could show proof, he could radio his supervisor. So I handed him my license and opened the app and showed the GPS screen with my name at the top and my VIN number displayed. And he made a face like he wanted a break from whatever teenage soap he was suddenly in. And he called his supervisor, a woman in a blazer with a walkie, and I explained again, low voice, calm, and she said, "Ma'am, if you can show any proof in the vehicle, we can release it to you." And I said I can. And she walked me to the car, and I opened the glove box and pulled my registration with my name, and I pulled my insurance card with my name, and she took pictures and said okay, and she handed me the keys, and it was done in 2 minutes because I prepared for the day I would need to prove what was mine. And I slid into my seat, and the smell of Tyler's cologne hit me, and I did not fall apart because I had other things to do. I thanked the supervisor. I tipped the valet kid $20 because none of this is his fault. And I pulled away from the curb like a woman who paid her own down payment. And I parked on a side street under some big trees where the light felt kinder. And I sat there and breathed. And then I started the list. Step 1, text the cousin whose barbecue Tyler used as cover. And the cousin texted a photo of an empty smoker and said, "Barbecues tomorrow, Lowell. Must have mixed it up." And that told me the story was his alone. Step 2, call my bank and remove Tyler as an authorized user on my credit card because I added him last year when he was between jobs. Step 3, open my Notes app and build a timeline in case he makes me feel crazy later. Step 4, think about my lease and whether his name is on it. It is not. And step 5, tell the truth to myself without self-harm, which is that I knew something was off for months. The late nights, the canceled plans, the sudden concern about new shirts, the way he turned his phone face down and called it a boundary. And I let it ride because I wanted to believe that my stability would train him into one person, and all I did was teach him how safe my forgiveness was. And now here we were. And my phone buzzed and it was a text from Tyler. "Hey babe, on my way back. Traffic crazy." And I looked at the time, 4:42 p.m., and I typed, "Which direction are you coming from?" And 3 dots bubbled, then stopped. And then he wrote, "East." And I wrote, "From where?" And 3 dots bubbled, and then nothing. And I put the phone down because I will not play fish with bait I did not throw. And I drove home slow. I parked. I went inside. I let Bandit out. I fed him. And then I swept the kitchen because sometimes your hands need a job while your heart takes stock. And at 5:13 p.m., I heard his footsteps. He came in light and fast, and he said, "You will not believe the line at H-E-B." And he set a crinkling plastic bag on the counter with a bag of ice and a pack of gum. No charcoal. And I looked at the bag like it was a prop from a bad play. And I said, "The valet at the hotel was kind," and he stood there blinking like someone who thought he was entering one scene and found himself in another. And he said, "What?" And I said, I picked up my car from valet at the Blue Lantern, and the color drained from his face until his freckles looked like islands, and his mouth worked, and I saw the lies line up behind his teeth like airplanes on a runway, and I held up my hand because I did not want to hear them, and I said, "I will go first. You took my car for a quick trip. You said 15 minutes? You went to Rook and Ember at 4:07 p.m. with a woman in a gold watch. You laughed. You split dessert. You tipped cash. And then you drove my car to the Blue Lantern. You handed the valet my keys. You took that woman inside, and I took my car back. And right now I am talking to you because I want to be fair, and I want to say this once without shouting, and you will listen without interrupting, and then you can speak. And if you lie, this conversation ends." And Tyler sat down hard on the stool and put his hands flat on the counter like he was prepping for a push-up. And he said, "Maya, please, it is not what you think." And I said, "What I think is that you took my property to pursue another woman, and that is enough truth to make every detail after it a footnote." and he checked his phone like the truth might text him a rescue. And then he started. He said, she is a client who needed advice on a real estate thing. He said it was a networking thing. He said he ran into her by accident and did not want to be rude. He said the hotel was a walkthrough for an event his friend is planning. He said the word nothing 3 times, as in, nothing happened. And I watched his face, like I watched the freeway during a merge. And I waited for the moment where he would see that my eyes were clear, and it came, and he shut his mouth. And then he tried the other door. He said, "Okay, yes. I know how it looks. But we were just talking. She is a friend from way back." And I said her name because I had already searched his Instagram following for brown bobs and gold watches, and he flinched. And a small, peaceful warmth moved through me, because even if he told me an entire novel, the first true thing his body said was the flinch. And I said, I am not here to convince you to tell me a prettier version of what I saw. I am here to draw a line. And I said, I will not share a bed with a man who uses my resources to court someone else. I will not guard a home while you write a story in another room. And I will not put Bandit through loud voices. And he shook his head and said, Babe, please, I messed up. I will fix it. I will cut her off. I love you. And he reached for me and I stepped back. And that was the first time I saw the shape of the end, the clean edges of it. And I said, you have tonight to gather your things that you purchased and that your name is on. Tomorrow at 9 I will change the locks, and on Monday I will remove you from my auto insurance. And his eyes got wet, and he said, can we slow down? And I said, we are exactly as slow as the choice you made when you turned left on West 4th. And then he got mad because grief often puts on anger to feel bigger. And he said, you are overreacting. It is not like we are married. And something in me laughed because the sentence tried to hurt me and missed. And I said, exactly. We are not. So this is a lease correction, not a divorce. And then my phone buzzed and it was a notification from my GPS app that said, the AirTag in my spare tire well moved for the first time in 3 hours, which made my mind snag like a sweater on a nail, because if my car was here, why would the AirTag be moving? And then Tyler blurted, okay, there is one more thing. And his voice slid into that thin place where he is suddenly 12, and he said, I borrowed your spare for a friend last week. The tire. I mean, he needed a donut for his Corolla. We were going to put it back. And my mind did the math. My spare was gone. The AirTag was on the move in someone else's trunk. And I felt a clean little click inside, a line between carelessness and disrespect that had not just been crossed but paved. And I said, thank you for telling me. I will handle replacing it. Please leave your key on the counter before you go tonight. And he said, you are really going to throw this away over nothing. And I said, you used the word nothing like a bandage, and I do not accept it. And then he said something quiet, ugly, about me being controlling, about the GPS. And I said, the GPS was installed after a theft, not to babysit a grown man. And also, if you feel watched, maybe ask who is holding the camera. And he stared at me, and I saw the last piece of hope in him pop like a soap bubble. And he went to the bedroom to pack. And I cleaned the counter because even endings deserve a tidy surface. And while he packed, I made calls. I called my lock guy. I called my insurance. I called my friend June, who has a guest room if I need to breathe somewhere else. And I called a tow company because sometimes symbolism helps the heart learn. I arranged for the tow to pick up his car, which was in my name because I co-signed last year when his credit took a hit. And the tow would bring it to the lot until he transferred the title to himself or surrendered it. And yes, I could do that because the registration still listed me as co-owner, and he was 60 days behind on his part of the insurance. And the woman at the tow place spoke like stones in a river, smooth and certain, and she said, we will be there at 8:30 tomorrow. And then I opened my laptop and drafted a simple letter that said, "Notice to vacate. Informal. No landlord, just me," that listed the items he could take and the ones he could not. And I printed 2 copies. And I breathed. And the evening went slow like honey. And he walked back and forth with bins and clothes, and that one guitar he never learned to play, and he tried to hum like he did not care. And I fed Bandit again. And I sat on the floor with him and told him we were okay. And at 10:06 p.m., Tyler stood by the door with a laundry basket and said, "Can we talk like adults?" And I said, "We just did for 4 hours. This is the adult part where we follow through." And he said he would be back in the morning to get his tools. And I said, "Text first." And he left the key and closed the door. And I locked it, and I leaned my forehead against the wood because it felt cool. And then I put the key in a small bowl and went to bed on top of the covers with the dog at my feet. And sleep came like a bandage. Not perfect, but enough. And at 6:40 a.m., I woke to the tow truck's beep and the sound of chains like a metal lullaby for people who choose themselves, and I watched from the window as his car rolled onto the flatbed, and I signed the form through the crack in the door, and the driver tipped his cap and said, "Clean break, huh?" And I said, "Working on it." And when the truck pulled away, the street looked wider, and then my phone buzzed again. It was a number I did not know, and a woman's voice said, "Hi, is this Maya?" And I said yes. And she said, "My name is Sienna. I think we should talk." And the quiet way she said my name told me she was the Gold Watch woman, and I could have hung up. I could have yelled. I could have handed my power to the worst part of me, but I did not. I said, "I have 10 minutes on the clock before a lock." Appointment. If you have something to say it plain. And she took a breath and said, "I did not know about you. I saw a clean apartment and a man who said he was ready. Last night he told me he was single. He told me the car was his. He told me he wanted to see where things could go. I saw your face in valet when you took the keys. I thought you were a sister. And I realized this morning I am not interested in being the kind of woman who needs other women to be fools for her to be happy. I am sorry." And I said, "Thank you for calling. I do not need anything else from you. Take care of yourself." And she said, "Can I send you the screenshots of what he told me? I think you might need them." And my first instinct was no, because I do not want to turn a page and then tape it back in. But the operations manager in me said, documentation is a kindness to your future. So I said, "Send them." And the texts came in as blue bubbles in a row, and they were a map of a man building a house on sand. Promises, flirty photos, half-truths, a reservation confirmation for Rook and Ember at 3:30 p.m. A screenshot of a dating profile updated 2 weeks ago, and it did not break me, it organized me, and I put them in a folder labeled Car, Tyler, September. And I closed the folder and the doorbell rang, and it was my locksmith, a woman in dust-streaked jeans with a drill and kind eyes, and she changed out the deadbolt while Bandit watched like she was building us a new life. And when she was done, I felt my throat ache. And she said, "It gets better faster than you think when you stop reopening the wound." And I tipped her well. And then I stood in my little kitchen with the morning light making squares on the floor, and I made a list titled Act 2, because I like naming things. And under it I wrote, "Cancel authorized user, close joint utilities, schedule title consult at DMV for co-owned car, box his mail, replace spare tire and AirTag, book therapy session Tuesday 2 p.m. And then the door shook with a knock that is a signature, and I knew it was Tyler by the rhythm. And I squared my shoulders and answered, and he stood there with 2 friends behind him like a jury. And he said, "You had my car towed." And I said, "Our car, co-owned, brought to the lot until you assume payments or surrender title." And he started to raise his voice, and I put my hand up and said, Bandit is in the room? Lower your tone. And he did. And he said, You are making this so dramatic. And I said, I am making this lawful and final. And his friend with the baseball cap puffed up like he wanted to add his breath to the fire. And I said, This is not a group project. And I handed Tyler a manila envelope with a list of his items, a deadline, and a copy of the tow slip with the lot address. And I watched it land in his hand like a weight. And he read the first line and said, You really wrote a deadline. And I said, I manage routes for a living. I know how to get from here to done. And he looked past me into the apartment like he could pull something he forgot from thin air. And he said, You are going to miss me. And I said, I am going to miss who I thought you were. And that is a different grief. And he swallowed too hard and said, Can we talk tonight? Just us. Dinner, please. And I said, No, we said everything. The next time we talk, it will be about the title or the dog's vaccination record. And he nodded like he finally saw the wall was real, and he turned and left with his friends. And the hallway smelled like rain, though the sky was clear. And I shut the door and leaned against it, and let my body shake like a bridge in wind, not breaking, just adjusting to new load. And then I went to my laptop and pulled up the DMV appointment page and booked Wednesday at 10:30 a.m. And I pulled my credit report to ensure no surprise accounts had my name. And I called my mother and told her the truth in 10 sentences, because she is a woman who thinks in recipes. And then I went for a walk around the block with Bandit, and I saw a little girl on a scooter and her dad jogging behind, and I felt a tenderness for people who are still allowed to trust without checking. And when I returned, there was an envelope on my doormat with my name in Tyler's quick, slanted handwriting, and I opened it, and there was a single key and a note that said, I am sorry. I will fix it. Please don't hate me. And I slipped the key on a ring with a label that said Old Key and put it in a drawer because we do not throw away evidence even when we throw away a life. And the day moved forward, and I ate a peach over the sink, and I breathed, and I waited for the moment grief would try to make me nostalgic for pain, and I promised myself I would let it pass through without unpacking. And that is when my phone pinged with a calendar. Invite from an unknown email address. It said, Meeting, Blue Lantern 7 p.m. And the location field said, Courtyard table by the fountain. And the sender was Tyler's gold watch woman. And I stared at the screen because invites are my language. And I had to decide whether Act 2 would be me staying the course or taking one dangerous detour into the place where answers live. And I set the phone down and said out loud to the empty room, I will not go. And Bandit tilted his head. And I said, I will not go. And I made tea, and I held the cup like a warm stone. And at 6:28 p.m., I put the cup down and picked up my keys. Which is how you know we sometimes choose the complicated version of healing. And I told myself it would be 10 minutes. I would ask one question, and then I would leave. And I locked the door and stepped into the warm evening with the cicadas talking like broken speakers. And I drove to the Blue Lantern and parked in the same side street where the light felt kind. And I walked through the arch to the courtyard where the fountain shot water like laughter cut short. And Sienna, the woman with the bob and the gold watch, stood when she saw me. She wore a white blouse and jeans and a face that looked like a person who slept less than 3 hours. And I sat, and she said, Thank you for coming. And I said, 10 minutes. And she nodded, and she slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed screenshots, a copy of a hotel reservation for next weekend in San Antonio with my car listed as vehicle on file, a photo of a list in Tyler's handwriting that said, Ask Maya for spare, get new shirts, book Friday. And it hit me that sometimes you do not just lose a person, you lose the version of yourself that trusted them with your hours. And Sienna said, I wanted you to see this because sometimes when you close a door, people rattle it until you wonder if you imagined the lock. And I said, I appreciate the clarity. I cannot give you anything in return. And she said, I do not want anything. I am just correcting a record. And we sat there as the fountain kept talking, and she said, He told me you were controlling. And I said, I am not. I am careful, and that difference saves lives. And she said, I can see that. And I stood and said, Take care. And she said, You too. And I walked away without looking back because my eyes belonged to my next choice, not my last one. And when I reached home, the street smelled like grills and cut grass. And I unlocked my new lock. And I fed the dog. And I wrote in my notes, Act 2. The part where he tries to pull me back. And I keep walking. And I believed myself. And then a text came from an unknown number that said, You think you won because you had my car towed? This is not over. And I recognized the rhythm of his friend's voice inside the words. And I turned off my phone and put it in the drawer with the old key because not every noise needs an answer. And I lay down and watched the ceiling fan carve circles in the air, and I felt the edges of a plan for the final act settle in my chest, like a loaded backpack you decide to wear on purpose. And I whispered, I am not going to burn down his life. I am going to close every door he opened in my name. And then I slept and dreamed of a map where every road led home. I woke up knowing what the last act had to be. It was not fireworks. It was paper, signatures, and a calm voice that would not shake even if someone else did. And I started with the list because lists are how I build a road I can walk. Monday at 8:05 a.m. I called the credit union that held the car note, the one I co-signed for when Tyler swore last spring that steady work was around the corner, and I asked to speak to a supervisor. And when a woman named Carla came on, I told her my name, my account, and the situation. Co-owner requesting a temporary hold on voluntary repossession, while the other party assumes the loan or surrenders the vehicle. I gave the dates he had missed payments, the insurance gap, the tow slip number, and I asked for the exact steps to transfer title or turn in the car without damage to my credit. And Carla spoke with the voice of someone who has explained this to many people who didn't listen. And she said, Bring your ID, the registration, the tow receipt, the loan agreement, and either a notarized assumption from the co-borrower or a surrender form signed by both. And she said, I can put a note on the account that no release is allowed without your signature. And I said, Please do. And she read the note back to me line by line, and the knot in my chest loosened one turn because control was returning to my side of the table. I printed the forms, I put them in a folder labeled Vehicle, Action, and then I texted Tyler one clear message, Wednesday 10:30 a.m. DMV and Credit Union. You can assume the loan or surrender the vehicle. Please be on time, and I did not add a single extra word because extra words are where people try to move you, and I put the phone face up and left the room. I packed the things he had forgotten, a hoodie that smelled like a college dorm, a jar of coins, a childhood photo album he almost left behind which told me a lot, and I put them in a box and labeled it with his last name. And I cleared one shelf he had used and wiped it down until it shone, and I breathed, and I fed Bandit and checked his tags, and I pulled the adoption papers we filed last year when we took him in from the shelter. My signature was first, his was second. The microchip was registered to me with my email, and the vet bills were under my account because I was the one who took him for shots when Tyler slept through his alarm. And I felt the heat of a future fight about the dog try to rise. And I set the papers on the counter under a magnet and said to the empty kitchen, He will not take you from me. And Bandit wagged like he understood words. And then I opened my laptop and sent 2 emails. One to my landlord letting him know there would be a change in occupancy. One to HR at work asking for Wednesday morning off for an appointment. And I wrote them both in simple language because clarity is a kindness even when you hurt, At noon, I walked to the tire shop and bought a new spare, asked them to install it and check the well for any damage, and when the tech lifted the mat, we found the scrape where someone careless had dragged the old one out, and I looked at it like a bruise and told myself that bruise was going to heal. And the tech handed me the new AirTag I had bought, and I tucked it under the mat. Not because I did not trust myself, but because life is long and I like backups. That night, I booked a therapy appointment and wrote myself a short promise. I will not use revenge to become someone I do not like. I will use accountability to become someone I do. Tuesday, I worked my roots, answered calls, and kept my voice steady even when a patient told me between sobs that the walker didn't fit. I drove out with a measuring tape and adjusted the legs until it did. Sometimes helping someone else stand is how you remember you can. That evening, a friend came by with tacos, and we ate them on the stoop and watched the street go purple. And I told her the facts in a row without dramatics, and she said, "I am proud of you," and I felt something gentle and true move across my chest like a bird's shadow. Wednesday came with a thin rain. I dressed in a white shirt and dark jeans and tied my hair back. I put the folder in my bag. I left early because early is my love language for myself. And when I pulled into the credit union lot, he was already there leaning against his car like a man in a commercial. He had combed his hair and chosen a smile, and he lifted his hand and I nodded, without giving him my mouth. Inside the lobby smelled like printers and lemon. We took a number and sat apart by two chairs. He tried small talk about weather, about how bad it was, and I said, "We can talk about the vehicle." And he gave me a look that begged for the old softness. But I am not a blanket. I am a person, and the number. Board beeped and lit, and we stepped to Carla's window. I handed her my file, and Tyler started his charm routine. He called her by her name and set his elbow on the counter, and Carla did not give him a thing. She looked at me because I was the one with the binder, and I said, "We're here to either sign an assumption or a surrender." And she laid out the forms like a quiet river. Here is the assumption, here is the surrender. Here is the itemized balance. Here is the insurance requirement. And he took the assumption form and held it like a man who wanted to be seen holding responsibility. And then he read the numbers and his mouth tightened and he said, "That's steep." And Carla said, "These are the terms you agreed to." And I said nothing, because silence is sometimes a mirror. And he tried to pivot. He said, "What if we just keep it how it is?" And Carla said, "No release without both signatures." And he looked at me and said, "Maya, is this really necessary?" And I said, "Yes, because I will not carry debt for someone who carries my keys to other people's plans." And the word landed exactly where I put it. He put the assumption form down like it was hot and picked up the surrender. And I watched his face as he stood there at the point where his easy was about to end. And something small in me softened and said, "He is a person who does not know how to grow without a crisis, and that is not your job to supply." And he signed the surrender, and Carla witnessed it and slid me a copy. And she stamped the account note and gave me a timeline for pickup. And it was not revenge when I felt the relief. It was gravity, leaving my shoulders. We walked out under the gray sky, and he said, "So that's it." And I said, "For the car? Yes. Next, the DMV for the co-signed title release." And he said, "You don't have to do this all today." And I said, "I do. Because every day I leave a door half open is a day I do not rest." We drove separately to the DMV, waited with the baby who squealed 2 rows over, listened to numbers being called that did not belong to us. When ours came, I stepped up first and spoke clearly. Co-owner requesting removal from title upon surrender, forms on file, lien holder note placed, and the clerk, a woman with nails painted like tiny sunsets, clicked through screens, printed the release, had us sign in black ink, stamped in red. The sound of the stamp was a period at the end of a long sentence, and we stepped out into a parking lot that smelled like wet asphalt and freedom. He stood with his hands in his pockets and said, "I never thought you would actually go through with all this." And I said, "I never thought you would use my car for a date." And we let the quiet do the rest. I told him I would leave his box with the friend he trusted, and he nodded. And then he said, "Can we talk about Bandit?" And my heart went still. And he said, "He's my dog." And I said, "He is our dog, but legally he is mine. Adoption papers, microchip, vet bills, and more important than paper, he is staying in his home where his routine is. This is non-negotiable." And the anger flashed across his face like a match you strike and blow out. He said, "You're cold." And I said, "No. I am warm to what is mine and cool to what hurts me." And I left. That afternoon, I took the box to his friend's porch and texted the photo of it on the welcome mat. Deliver complete. And then I went home and scrubbed the kitchen floor. Not because it was dirty, but because I wanted to feel water and soap turning something into clean. Late that night, my phone lit with 4 messages in a row. 2 from unknown numbers calling me names that sound like metal dropped on concrete. 1 from Tyler saying he missed me, 1 from Sienna saying he messaged her too. I replied to none. I put the phone on, do not disturb, and slept. Thursday, I returned the tow company's call to schedule the credit union pickup. Friday, the driver took the co-signed car from the lot to the lender. I signed one last form under a strip of buzzing light and said thank you, and the driver said, "I like when people do this the neat way." And I smiled because neat is a word that has been used against me, and I now own it. Saturday morning, I took Bandit to the greenbelt, and we waded in shallow water, and I let the cold climb my calves until it taught my body a new boundary. In the afternoon, I got a voicemail from a number I recognized as the Blue Lantern. The manager said, "Ms. Ellis, we wanted to confirm that the room booked under your vehicle on file has been canceled as you requested. The guest tried to check in, and we declined to place the hold. We thought you should know." I stood in my kitchen and let my eyes close around the picture of him at the desk. Hand out, smile ready, and the clerk gently turning the screen back toward herself. And I did not feel triumph. I felt a ledger balancing. Week 2 arrived with small echoes. He dropped a final text. "Please talk to me." I blocked it. His friend posted a vague message about women who ruin men. I ignored it. My mother mailed me a card with a recipe for lemon bars and a note that said, "Cut the sugar a little and everything tastes more like itself." And I pinned it to the corkboard because every home needs a sentence to live by. I took the therapy hour and said it all out loud to a person whose only job was to ask. And when she asked what I wanted my life to look like without him, I said, "Like my car when I got it back. Clean, paid for, pointed at places I actually want to go." The next little storm was the job of closing the last joint utility. The internet bill, his name as authorized. I walked into the store with a binder and walked out with a confirmation number. I added it to the folder. I made a spreadsheet for my next month's budget that did not ask me to help a grown man again. I bought myself a new set of sheets and slept under them with the fan spinning like a quiet oath. On a Wednesday near the end of the month, I ran into his cousin at the store, the one with the barbecue cover story, and he looked at me with a face that wanted me to say something to make him feel better about what he did not say then. And I said, "Hope your cookout went well." And I walked on, because I will not heal other people's shame. That Friday, there was a knock at my door, and I looked and found a small package with no return address. Inside was the old AirTag from my spare, dead battery taped to it. No note. And it made me laugh because even his attempt at a gesture felt like homework turned in late. I put it in the drawer with the old key. A tiny museum of lessons. A week later, Sienna texted one sentence. "He told me you stole his car." I replied with the tow slip and the surrender form and nothing else. She wrote back, Thank you. I blocked the thread, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. I do not need to keep conversations that only exist to prove I am not a villain. The next big thing was small on paper. I planned a weekend by myself, booked a cheap cabin by the river 2 hours out, threw a book in a bag, put Bandit in the back seat with a blanket, and drove. The road out of Austin unspooled and the sky turned wide and the white flowers on the side of the highway nodded like people who agree with you. At the cabin, I cooked one meal that was all crunch, cucumbers and apples and a handful of chips. And I sat by the water and said the words I could not say in my apartment without hearing old echoes. I said, "You deserve trust that does not require a tracking app. You deserve love that does not ask you to be a detective. You deserve a car that smells like your lotion and not a stranger's cologne." And I watched a leaf turn in a small current and ride it like a plan. Calling the end revenge would be wrong because revenge wants the other person to feel what you felt. I do not want to give him my feelings. I want to give myself my time back. So my last act was not a dramatic reveal, but a letter I wrote to myself. And then, one I wrote to him, that I did not send. Mine said, "You did not lose an almost. You chose a yes to yourself. Keep going." His said, "I release you from every version of me you tried to use. We are done." And I folded it and put it in the drawer with the key and the battery, because file systems prevent relapses. Then the twist came small and late. A notification popped on my phone from a resale app where I had posted a bookshelf last week. The buyer said they would come by at 7. At 7 there was a knock. And when I opened the door, it was the valet kid from Blue Lantern with his mom. They were picking up the shelf. He recognized me after a second and his face did a little startle, and he said, "You're the woman with the car." And his mom gave him a look like, "Be quiet." And I laughed and said, "That was me." And he said, "I told my boss about how you had your papers in order. They said we should use your story for training." And his mom said, "He's been getting better at not getting rolled by sweet talkers." And I felt a warmth I did not expect. Like a small ribbon across a race no one saw me run. After they left, I sat on the floor where the shelf used to be and let the empty wall look at me. I thought about the map on my app and the map in my chest and how neither of them needs to light up blue to tell me where I am next. A month later, the credit union mailed me a confirmation that the surrendered vehicle account was closed. No balance owed. Score unaffected. I pinned it to my corkboard next to my mother's lemon bar note. I took the silver sedan for an oil change and the mechanic said, "She runs clean." And I said, "So, do I?" And I drove home with the windows cracked and the radio low, passing the corner where Rook and Ember sits like a stage set for a life I will not walk into again. I didn't look up. My eyes stayed on the road. Ahead was a light turning green. I rolled through. Bandit yawned in the back, and I felt that deep and simple peace that comes when your car and your heart and your plans are all in your own hands. The twist I promised myself came one more time when a postcard arrived from San Antonio with no return address, a hotel with string lights drawn in pen. On the back, one sentence: "Sometimes you save a stranger you will never meet." Signed with an S and a tiny gold dot. I put it in the drawer with the key and the battery and the letter I never sent, a tiny archive of choices. On the anniversary of the day, he said 15 minutes. I took my car to the hill country at 3:18 p.m., just me and a thermos and a playlist of songs that do not cheat. And when the sky went orange, I whispered a thank you to the version of me who put on her shoes and went to find the truth while it was still warm. I chose myself without screaming. I made calls and closed accounts and showed up with papers. I did not set a match to anything. I made sure the door shut. And that is my favorite kind of ending. The quiet click you earn when you stop begging for someone else to hold your hand on the way out. The next morning, I woke to a clean calendar and a dog that needed a walk and a car that waited where I left it. These are the kinds of love that keep a person moving, not grand, not dramatic, reliable, faithful, mine. And sometimes when I hit a red light on West 4th, I smile to myself, not because of what happened there, but because I did not let it decide who I would be on the next street. And if you wanted a moral, here it is. When someone tells you 15 minutes, look at their feet and their keys and your map, and then look at yourself and decide. You can stay and argue with a liar, or you can become a person with a folder, a plan, and a car pointed toward home. I became that person, and I am not going back.